On August 20th, 1923, a ship broke through the Arctic fog near Wrangel Island. The crew expected to find 5 people living at the expedition camp. They found one woman, alone, who had taught herself to survive in conditions that had killed 4 men with expedition experience. Her name was Ada Blackjack. She was 25 years old, stood 4 feet 11 inches tall, and weighed less than 90 pounds. Before this expedition, she had never fired a gun, never hunted an animal, never trapped for food, and never spent a single night outdoors by herself. She was terrified of polar bears to the point of phobia. She could barely read English. The 4 men who brought her to this island were dead. She was not. This is the story of how a woman the world dismissed survived when everyone else failed. The mathematics of desperation are simple and cruel. In the spring of 1921, Ada Blackjack was living in Nome, Alaska, working any job she could find, and every calculation led to the same impossible conclusion. She did not have enough money to get her son back. His name was Bennett. He was 5 years old and he had tuberculosis. The orphanage where he lived required payment for his care. Ada earned perhaps $15 a month washing laundry for white families, cleaning houses when she could find the work, doing whatever labor a small Inupiaq woman could secure in a frontier town where most people looked through her as if she did not exist. $15 each month, and Bennett's care cost more than that. The numbers never worked. Every month she fell further behind, and every month the debt grew larger while her son grew thinner. She had been born Ada Delutuk in 1898 in a settlement called Spruce Creek, 8 miles from Solomon, Alaska. The place was remote even by Alaskan standards, where winter lasted 9 months and survival required knowledge passed down through generations. Her childhood was traditionally Inupiaq until everything changed. When she was 8 years old, her father died from food poisoning. Her mother, facing the reality of raising 2 daughters alone in a harsh environment, made a decision that would define Ada's entire life. She sent Ada and her sister Rita to a Methodist mission school in Nome. The missionaries meant well by their own standards. They taught Ada to read English, though she never became fluent enough to feel comfortable with written words. They taught her to sew garments in the Western style, cook food the way white people preferred it prepared, and pray to a Christian God who replaced the spiritual traditions of her people. They taught her that her traditional upbringing was something backward that needed correction, something primitive that should be replaced with civilization and progress. They did not teach her the skills Inupiaq women learned from their mothers and aunts: how to process seal and caribou, how to survive extended periods in wilderness conditions, how to read weather patterns and ice formations, how to hunt when hunting became necessary. Those skills were considered pagan practices, unnecessary for a civilized Christian woman who would live a domestic life serving white families. At 16 years old, Ada married a man named Jack Blackjack. He was a dog musher, and in the brief period before he revealed his true nature, Ada might have believed that marriage would provide the stability and safety she had been seeking since childhood. It did not provide either. Jack was violent in ways that went beyond occasional anger. The beatings were constant, brutal, and unpredictable. She had 3 children with him during their marriage. 2 of them died in infancy from causes the records do not specify. The 3rd child, Bennett, survived but was sickly from birth, showing signs of the respiratory weakness that would eventually develop into tuberculosis. In 1921, somewhere on the Seward Peninsula, roughly 40 miles from Nome, Jack Blackjack abandoned his family. He simply left one morning, taking whatever possessions he valued, and walking away without explanation or warning. Ada was alone with a 5-year-old sick child in a place that had no infrastructure for someone in her situation. She had no family nearby, no money saved, no options that made logical sense. She walked 40 miles back to Nome. Bennett was too weak to walk the entire distance, so she carried him when he could not continue on his own feet. 40 miles across terrain that could kill you if you made one navigational mistake or encountered the wrong weather, and she made it because the alternative was dying out there with her son in her arms. Nome did not welcome her back with open arms or charity. Nome did not have resources allocated for poor Inupiaq women with sick children. She found work where she could, cleaning and washing and sewing, but Bennett needed more care than she could provide while working full days for minimal pay. The orphanage agreed to take him for a fee that was supposed to be temporary until Ada could get back on her feet. It was not temporary. She visited when she could afford the time away from work, which was not often enough. Every time she saw him through the orphanage window, he looked thinner, weaker, more like a child who would not survive another harsh Alaskan winter. That was her life in the spring of 1921. No husband, no home of her own, a son she could not afford to care for properly, but could not bear to lose. And then someone mentioned that an expedition was looking for a seamstress willing to travel north. Vilhjalmur Stefansson was famous throughout North America in 1921. He had written multiple books about Arctic exploration, lectured at universities and geographical societies, and built an international reputation on one central philosophical idea. The Arctic was not inherently hostile if you understood how to live there properly. He called it the friendly Arctic in his most popular book. You could thrive in those frozen regions, he insisted, if you abandoned Western assumptions about survival and learned directly from the land itself. His previous major expedition in 1913 had ended with his ship, the Karluk, crushed by pack ice and 11 men dead from starvation, exposure, and the desperate conditions that followed. Stefansson himself had survived by leaving the ship before disaster struck to hunt caribou on the mainland, which some people interpreted as prudent leadership and others viewed as abandonment of his crew. Either way, he had spun the catastrophic outcome into proof of his core philosophy. He survived because he understood Arctic conditions, while the others died because they clung to conventional Western survival methods that did not work in extreme northern environments. By 1921, he was planning something new and ambitious. Wrangel Island, a piece of rock and ice and tundra, sitting approximately 87 miles north of the Siberian coast, was technically Russian territory, but remained uninhabited and unclaimed in any meaningful governmental sense. Stefansson wanted to claim it for Britain or Canada, establishing a territorial foothold in the Arctic that could have strategic value. His reasoning was that physical occupation trumped historical claims, and if a team could successfully live on the island for one full year, that would establish enough documented presence to justify a formal territorial claim. Geopolitically, the plan was dubious at best. Practically, it was reckless, bordering on criminal negligence. But Stefansson had secured funding from private backers. He had a compelling narrative about Arctic sovereignty, and he had no trouble recruiting young men who wanted adventure and recognition more than they wanted guaranteed safety. Alan Crawford was 20 years old, the son of a University of Toronto professor who had raised his children to value education and achievement. Crawford had grown up comfortable, well-educated, and ambitious in ways that came from never having faced real hardship. He had read Stefansson's books cover to cover and believed every word without questioning the underlying assumptions. When Stefansson offered him the chance to lead the expedition to Wrangel Island, Crawford accepted immediately. He had minimal Arctic experience beyond some winter camping trips, but he had confidence, intelligence, and the kind of upper-class certainty that mistakes preparation for destiny. He kept meticulous journals because he saw himself as a future explorer whose documentation would matter to history. Lorne Knight was 28 years old, and he had already survived one Stefansson disaster. He had been on the Karluk expedition as a young crew member, one of the survivors who had endured months stranded on ice after the ship sank, watching men die slowly from scurvy and starvation while waiting for rescue that took far too long to arrive. Most people who survived something that traumatic would never voluntarily return to the Arctic, under any circumstances. Night returned. He signed up for Wrangel Island knowing exactly what the Arctic could do to unprepared people. And he either genuinely believed Stephenson's philosophy could protect him this time, or he had stopped caring about the odds of survival. He was quiet, competent with rifles, and carried a darkness that came from watching men die in previous frozen wastelands. Fred Mara was 28 years old, also a Karluk survivor who had experienced the same horrors as Knight. More than that, Mara had spent 8 months on Wrangel Island itself in 1914 as part of the Karluk shipwreck aftermath, living in desperate conditions with limited supplies before rescue finally arrived. He knew the island was not friendly. He knew it was a place where survival required constant work and occasional luck. He went anyway, perhaps because he needed to prove something to himself about his own capability, or perhaps because nothing else in civilian life felt significant after what he had already survived. Milton Galler was 19 years old, the youngest member of the expedition and the least experienced by considerable margin. He had never been to the Arctic before this journey. He had never lived anywhere that required genuine survival skills. He was a teenager with dreams of exploration and adventure, the kind of dreams that come from reading books about heroic expeditions without understanding the parts those books leave out. Stephenson gave him a chance to prove himself, and Galler accepted with the enthusiasm of someone too young to properly calculate risk. 4 young men with minimal combined hunting experience but maximum combined confidence. Stephenson told them to bring 6 months of supplies, enough food and equipment to last through one winter and into the following summer. After 6 months, they would need to hunt for their sustenance. The island would provide seal, walrus, polar bear, and whatever other game they needed. The plan assumed animal populations would be abundant and accessible. It assumed weather would be manageable. It assumed 4 men with limited Arctic hunting skills would suddenly become expert providers capable of feeding themselves entirely off the land. Every assumption was optimistic to the point of fantasy. The people of Nome heard about this expedition plan and told Stephenson directly that he was sending people to their deaths. The Inupiaq community, especially people who actually understood Arctic survival through generations of lived experience, told him the plan was fundamentally flawed. Wrangel Island was not the friendly Arctic of his books. It was a frozen wasteland where survival required specific knowledge these men did not possess, and 6 months of supplies was not enough buffer for the inevitable failures that would come. Stephenson ignored all of it. What the men needed for basic survival, Stephenson decided was an Inupiaq woman, someone to sew and repair their cold weather gear throughout the year, because in Arctic conditions, gear maintenance was not optional luxury, but literal survival. A torn seam in a parka or a compromised seal on a boot could result in frostbite and death within hours. Clothing had to be inspected constantly and repaired immediately. They approached several Inupiaq women in Nome with their recruitment offer. The terms were clearly stated. 1 full year on Wrangel Island, $50 per month paid upon return, duties limited to sewing and basic cooking. Every woman they approached refused. They understood what these confident young men did not. This expedition was a gamble with terrible odds, and the prize for winning was simply staying alive. Then the recruiters found Ada Blackjack. $50 per month was more money than Ada had ever imagined earning through legitimate work. 12 months of that pay meant $600 total, enough to pay off all of Bennett's accumulated care costs, bring him home from the orphanage, and perhaps even relocate somewhere with better opportunities and a real chance at building a stable life. The men assured her she would be completely safe under their protection. She would only sew and cook basic meals. They would handle all the dangerous work, all the hunting, all the heavy labor. The island was temporary, they told her. 1 year at most, possibly less, if the relief ship arrived early in the summer season. Then she would return home with enough money to transform her circumstances entirely. Ada had deep misgivings that went beyond rational calculation. She had been told her entire life by missionaries, employers, and society that she was timid, fearful, not strong enough for any world outside mission schools and laundry rooms. This expedition felt like proof that she was right to doubt herself, that she was not cut out for something this dangerous and remote. But Bennett needed her to succeed, and $50 per month was the only number that solved an otherwise unsolvable problem. She said yes. Before departure, she visited a traditional shaman in Nome, seeking guidance or protection, or perhaps just confirmation of what she already knew. The historical record does not specify her exact motivation. The shaman told her what her instincts had already been screaming: death and danger lay ahead on this journey. Fire and knives, be watchful. Be prepared. It was not reassuring, but Ada was not looking for reassurance at that point. She was looking for money, and the expedition had money to offer. On September 9th, 1921, Ada Blackjack boarded the schooner Silver Wave in Nome Harbor. She brought her sewing kit with supplies for repairs, some personal items including photographs of Bennett, and a fear of polar bears so intense it bordered on genuine phobia. She had never seen a polar bear in person, but the stories she had heard from hunters and elders were enough to create nightmares. Crawford, Knight, Mora, and Galler were in high spirits as the ship prepared to depart. They joked with each other, discussed their plans for the coming year, and treated the voyage like the beginning of a grand adventure that would make their names known. There was also a cat on board, a grey tabby named Victoria, that someone had brought for companionship and morale during the long, dark Arctic winter. The cat had no idea where it was going or what waited ahead. The Silver Wave made the ocean crossing without significant incident. The Arctic in September was as navigable and calm as it ever became, which was still rough by most maritime standards, but manageable for an experienced crew. On September 15, 1921, the ship reached Wrangel Island and anchored as close to shore as the shallow, rocky coast allowed. The crew unloaded all the supplies and equipment, helped establish a basic base camp structure, and prepared to leave. The ship's captain had a schedule to maintain and cargo contracts to fulfill. He was not staying near Wrangel Island any longer than absolutely necessary. He promised to send a relief ship the following summer to check on the expedition and transport them home. Then the Silver Wave raised anchor and sailed away toward the horizon. 5 people stood on the beach watching the ship disappear. 4 confident men, 1 frightened woman, and a cat, 140 miles from the nearest human settlement. No radio communication equipment. No backup plan if something went wrong. Just Wrangel Island and whatever it decided to do to them over the coming year. For the first few weeks after the ship departed, the expedition felt almost manageable to everyone involved. They organized the base camp with systematic efficiency, built shelters using driftwood they collected from the beach, and salvaged materials they had brought on the ship, established a daily routine for cooking, hunting patrols, gear maintenance, and general camp operations. Ada sewed as she had been hired to do, inspecting every piece of cold weather gear for weak seams or developing tears. The men went out hunting regularly, though their success rate was inconsistent at best. They killed a seal one day, a fox the next, nothing for several days after that. The results were nowhere close to the abundance Stephenson had confidently described in his books and recruitment speeches. Still, the weather was relatively mild by Arctic standards, and they had 6 months of supplies to fall back on when hunting failed. Alan Crawford took his role as expedition leader with complete seriousness. He documented everything in a detailed journal: daily weather patterns, hunting outcomes, observations about the island's wildlife and geography, notes on group morale. He was methodical, organized, and optimistic in his written entries. Crawford saw himself as a future explorer whose careful records would contribute to geographical knowledge, and he wrote with that future audience in mind. His early journal entries from September and October reflect genuine confidence that they had made the right decision and would complete their mission successfully. Lorne. Knight was notably quieter than the others. He had survived the Karluk disaster and understood from direct experience how quickly conditions could deteriorate in the Arctic. While Crawford documented and Galla expressed enthusiasm, Knight focused on hunting with an intensity that suggested he knew their survival depended entirely on securing food before winter made everything harder. He hunted more aggressively than the others, spent longer hours away from camp searching for game, and showed visible frustration when days passed without success. Fred Maurer had been on Wrangel Island before during the Karluk aftermath in 1914, so he understood the terrain better than anyone else in the group. That previous experience did not help as much as he had hoped it would. The island in 1914 had nearly killed him through slow starvation. The island in 1921 showed no signs of being any friendlier or more generous. Maurer knew they were starting from behind and would need considerable luck to catch up. Milton Galla remained enthusiastic and eager through the early weeks. He was 19 years old and wanted desperately to prove he belonged on a serious expedition. He volunteered for every task, worked hard on camp improvements, and tried to match the older men's competence. For a brief period, he could tell himself this adventure was working exactly as planned. Ada stayed close to camp, focused on her assigned duties. She sewed constantly, repairing tears and reinforcing seams, because in Arctic conditions, even small gaps in clothing could result in deadly frostbite. But she also cooked every meal, fetched water by melting ice and snow, maintained the camp's living spaces, and managed a dozen other tasks the men had not explicitly mentioned during recruitment. They had told her she would just sew. That was not true, and it became less true with each passing week. She worked from early morning until late at night, and the men accepted her labor without acknowledgement that she was doing far more than they had promised she would need to do. By November, the sun disappeared below the horizon. The Arctic winter does not arrive gradually with gentle transitions. The light dies completely and you are left with darkness that lasts for months, broken only by brief twilight periods around midday. Temperatures dropped far below zero. The wind came directly off the pack ice with nothing to slow it down, turning the island into a place where exposed skin froze solid within seconds. Hunting became exponentially harder. Visibility was severely limited even during the few hours of twilight. Game became scarce as animals changed their behavior for winter. Going outside for any reason required extensive preparation that consumed half the available energy. Their food supplies were running low faster than anyone had calculated. 6 months of food sounds substantial until you are burning thousands of calories daily just maintaining body temperature in sub-zero conditions. They started rationing, not severely at first, but enough that everyone noticed meals were getting smaller and less frequent. The hunting was not producing anywhere near enough to supplement their shrinking stores. The math was becoming unavoidably clear. They did not have enough food to last until a relief ship could arrive in summer. Then Lorne Knight started showing symptoms that none of them immediately recognized. It began with overwhelming fatigue that seemed disproportionate to his activity level. He was tired all the time, lethargic in ways that did not match his usual personality. Then his gums started bleeding. His teeth loosened in their sockets. He developed sores on his skin that would not heal properly. Scurvy, the disease that had killed sailors for centuries, caused by severe vitamin C deficiency, and completely preventable if you understand nutrition. Fresh meat contains enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy, especially organ meat like liver, heart, and kidneys. If they had been eating fresh organs from the seals and foxes they occasionally caught, Knight would not have developed scurvy at all. But they had been raised with Western assumptions about food, where muscle meat was considered the premium cut, and organs were seen as inferior or unpleasant. They ate the muscle meat from their kills, preserved what they could, and threw away or fed to the dog team the very parts that would have kept them healthy. Their cultural assumptions about proper food were literally killing them. Knight's condition deteriorated steadily through December and into January. By midwinter, he was in constant pain, barely able to move without assistance, unable to chew solid food because his gums were too damaged. The others tried to care for him, but they did not understand what was wrong or how to fix it. They had no medicine, no medical reference books, no way to diagnose the problem correctly. In November, tensions in camp reached a breaking point over something that seemed minor but revealed deeper problems. Ada had been working constantly, sewing and cooking and maintaining camp, but she was exhausted and frightened and far from home. One evening, Knight ordered her to patch a pair of boots immediately. She refused, saying she was too tired and would do it the following morning. Knight's response was brutal. He dragged her outside into the freezing darkness and tied her to the expedition's flagpole, leaving her there in sub-zero temperatures as punishment for disobedience. Crawford and the others did nothing to stop him. When she was finally brought back inside hours later, shaking from cold and fear, the message was clear. She was not a paid employee with rights, but essentially a servant who would comply or suffer consequences. After that incident, the men began withholding food from Ada when she did not complete tasks to their satisfaction quickly enough. It was not formal policy they discussed, just cruelty that emerged from their desperation and frustration. She learned to keep her head down, work constantly, and never refuse anything they demanded, no matter how exhausted she became. By early 1923, the situation had become completely untenable. Knight was bedridden and dying slowly. Their food supplies were nearly exhausted. The relief ship would not arrive until summer at the earliest, still months away. They could not survive on the island that long without more food than they were catching. Something had to change, or everyone would die there. Crawford, Mara, and Galla made a decision that seemed logical given their impossible situation. They would leave the island, cross the sea, ice south to Siberia, approximately 80 miles away, find a coastal settlement, get help, and organize a rescue party to return for Knight and Ada. The ice looked solid enough for travel. They were young, physically capable, and running out of alternatives. Staying on the island meant certain death from starvation. Leaving was risky, but at least it offered a chance. Knight could not possibly travel. He could barely sit upright in his cot. Someone had to stay with him, and that person was Ada. She had been hired to sew and cook. Now she was being asked to care for a dying man alone while 3 men crossed frozen ocean and hoped not to die in the attempt. On January 28, 1923, Crawford, Mara, and Galla packed light supplies, took 1 rifle and minimal ammunition, and set out across the sea ice walking south toward Siberia. The ice looked solid from shore. They believed they could make the crossing in a week if conditions held. They were never seen again. The ice that looked solid from shore was not solid everywhere. At some point during their journey, the ice broke, or they got lost, or the weather turned, and they died from exposure. Their bodies were never recovered. 3 young men who believed in the friendly Arctic walked onto the pack ice and disappeared forever. Ada Blackjack was now the only healthy person on Wrangel Island, responsible for keeping herself and a dying man alive through the remainder of an Arctic winter. With almost no food left and no idea how to hunt, Lorne Knight was not an easy patient to care for in his final months. The scurvy had destroyed his body systematically. He could not chew food because his gums were bleeding constantly and his teeth were loose enough to fall out. He could not walk or even stand without assistance. He could barely speak without pain. He lay in his cot in the main tent, wrapped in every blanket they could spare, and Ada had to do everything for him. She made thin soups by boiling whatever scraps of meat remained until they were soft enough for him to swallow without chewing. She melted snow for water constantly because he needed fluids. She cleaned him when he was too weak to leave his cot. She read to him from his Bible, a family heirloom he had carried through 2 Arctic expeditions, because it was the only comfort she could provide. Sometimes, Knight was lucid and grateful for her care. He would thank her quietly, apologize for being a burden, ask her to tell him about Bennett and her life in Nome before the expedition. Sometimes the pain made him angry and cruel. He would lash out verbally, blame her for things completely beyond her control, accuse her of not doing enough, even though she was doing everything humanly possible. She kept trying regardless of his mood, because leaving him to die alone would have been abandoning her own humanity. But Knight desperately needed fresh meat with organ tissue to have any chance of recovery, and there was none available. The supply caches were almost completely empty. The island was not providing game, and Ada had absolutely no idea how to hunt animals for food. She had grown up in an Inupiaq community where hunting was exclusively men's work, knowledge passed down from fathers to sons through direct teaching and years of practice. Women processed the game men brought back, sewed the clothing, managed the camps, but the actual hunting was not part of women's education. Ada had never been taught how to stalk seals on ice, how to shoot accurately in high wind, how to butcher large kills properly. The Methodist missionaries had completely replaced that traditional education with Western domesticity training, Bible verses, cooking white people's food, sewing in European styles. Now she was alone on an Arctic island where hunting was the only thing that would keep her alive, and she had never learned the most basic skills. Knight, in his increasingly rare moments of clarity and lucidity, told her directly that she had to figure it out immediately. He could not hunt in his condition. She was the only person left. If she did not learn to hunt successfully, they would both die of starvation within weeks. So Ada took the expedition's rifle and walked to the beach to attempt something she had never done before. The first time she tried to shoot a seal, her hands shook so badly she could not keep the rifle aimed steadily. A seal surfaced near the shore ice, close enough that an experienced hunter would have considered it an easy shot. Ada raised the rifle, tried to aim, and her hands trembled from fear and inexperience. She fired. The recoil kicked back hard against her shoulder, startling her, and the shot went wide by several feet. The seal dove immediately and did not surface again nearby. She returned to camp with nothing but the knowledge that she had wasted ammunition they could not replace. She tried again the following morning and the morning after that, and every morning for weeks. She missed far more shots than she hit. Her hands continued shaking. Her aim was terrible. She did not know how to compensate for wind affecting bullet trajectory, how to track the movement patterns of seals, how to time a shot for the brief moment when a seal was vulnerable. But every single day she went out to the ice with that rifle, and every single day she learned something incrementally small, how to brace the rifle more firmly against her shoulder to manage recoil, how to breathe slowly and hold her breath at the moment of firing, how to watch for seals surfacing in predictable patterns near specific ice formations. One day, in late February, she finally hit one. The seal did not die immediately from her shot, which meant she had to finish killing it, which meant getting close to a large, injured animal thrashing in ice water while she was alone and inexperienced. She did it because there was no alternative. She hauled the dead seal back to camp, an animal that weighed considerably more than her own body weight, dragging it across broken ice and rocks because there was no other method of transport available. Then she faced the next impossible task. She had to skin and butcher it. She had never skinned a seal in her life. She might have seen it done during childhood before the mission school, but childhood observation and adult execution are entirely different skills. She made numerous mistakes. She wasted significant amounts of edible meat by cutting in wrong places. She punctured the hide in areas where experienced hunters would have kept it intact. But she managed to extract enough meat to feed herself and Knight for several days, and more importantly, she learned how seal anatomy worked, where to make initial cuts, how to separate blubber from muscle tissue. She killed another seal 2 weeks later, then another one after that. She was getting measurably better with each attempt. Not expert, not even particularly skilled, but competent enough to occasionally succeed, and occasional success was the difference between life and death. She also began trapping Arctic foxes using techniques she improvised from vague memories and trial and error. Fox pelts had trading value in Nome, and even though no traders would come to Wrangel Island, the act of trapping gave her a sense of purpose and routine that helped fight the psychological isolation. She set basic snare traps near camp, checked them every morning, and occasionally found a fox caught. Fox meat was extremely lean and not ideal for Arctic survival where fat was crucial, but it was additional protein that extended their supplies. She discovered she could collect seagull eggs when birds started returning in early spring to nest on coastal cliffs. She found edible roots, sweet roots that grew in the tundra during brief summer periods, and added them to her soups for variety and additional nutrients. She was teaching herself subsistence survival from absolute zero knowledge, one small lesson at a time, with no teacher and no margin for error. She also began experimenting with foods she would have never considered edible before desperation forced creativity. She collected algae from tide pools and boiled it into thin soups. She found lichen growing on rocks and tried adding it to her cooking, discovering that some varieties were palatable while others made her sick. She practiced shooting accuracy by setting up empty tea tins at increasing distances and forcing herself to hit them consistently before allowing herself to hunt live animals. Each small innovation was a tiny victory against the island's relentless hostility. Meanwhile, Lorne Knight continued dying by degrees. By March, he was barely conscious most of each day. His body was shutting down from advanced scurvy. The disease had progressed far beyond the point where recovery was realistic. Even if Ada had known to feed him fresh liver and organs at that stage, it likely would have been too late to reverse the damage. By April, he was bedridden continuously. She fed him thin soups when he could swallow. She cleaned him when he lost control of bodily functions. She read scripture to him because it seemed to provide some comfort. She knew it was not enough, but she had nothing else to offer. In early May, Knight asked her to write a letter to his parents back in Oregon. His hands no longer worked well enough to hold a pen, so Ada typed the letter slowly on Milton Galle's typewriter, her fingers stiff and clumsy from cold and malnutrition. Knight dictated between labored breaths, and she tried to capture his exact words. The letter was a goodbye to his family. He knew with absolute certainty that he was dying, and he wanted his parents to know he had been cared for in his final months, that he had not died alone and abandoned. He asked Ada specifically to deliver all his personal belongings to someone named Bennett after she was rescued. That was her son's name. Whether Knight knew that and was making a deliberate gesture, or whether it was pure coincidence, the historical record does not make clear. Ada wrote down the instruction and promised she would fulfill it if she survived to return home. On June 23, 1923, Lorne Knight died in his cot with Ada sitting beside him, reading from his family Bible. Ada Blackjack was now completely alone on Wrangel Island, with no idea if anyone was coming to rescue her. The first thing Ada did after Lorne Knight died was construct a defensive barricade. She could not bury his body. The ground was still frozen solid from winter despite the calendar saying it was summer, and she did not have tools powerful enough to dig a grave through permafrost several feet deep. She could not move Knight's body far from camp because he was a full-grown man, and she weighed less than 90 pounds, even before malnutrition. So she improvised a solution using available materials. She dragged every heavy box, crate, and container in camp and stacked them carefully around Knight's cot to form a physical wall between his corpse and the rest of the tent space. Polar bears were her primary concern. They possessed a sense of smell powerful enough to detect a seal carcass from miles away across ice and water. A human corpse would attract them just as effectively. Ada had to ensure they could not reach Knight's body, because if a polar bear tore through the tent, searching for the source of that smell, it would kill her in the process. She covered Knight's body as thoroughly as she could with blankets and tarps. She sealed off the area with her makeshift barricade. She moved her own sleeping space to the furthest possible corner of the camp. Then she returned to the daily work of keeping herself alive. By this point, in late June 1923, Ada had undergone a complete transformation from the person who had arrived on the island. The terrified woman who could not fire a rifle without her hands shaking uncontrollably was gone entirely. She could hunt seals now with reasonable competence. She could trap foxes using snares she built herself. She could repair all her own gear, navigate the terrain surrounding camp, and manage her limited food supplies to stretch them as far as possible. She had evolved from someone who needed constant protection to someone who could protect herself against one of the harshest environments on Earth. But the psychological isolation was crushing in ways that physical hardship was not. She talked to Victoria the cat constantly, having full conversations as if the animal could understand and respond. The cat became her psychological anchor, the only living creature she could interact with, and she cared for it with an intensity that went far beyond practical necessity. She also talked to herself continuously, narrating every task out loud as if someone were listening to her descriptions. I'm going to check the fox traps now. I am going to melt ice for drinking water. I am going to repair the tear in my parka sleeve. It was a strategy to fight the overwhelming silence, to keep her mind from spiraling into the panic that came from being the only human being on an island more than 100 miles from any settlement. The polar bears circled the camp almost daily throughout the summer, large adult males, hungry and endlessly curious, drawn by the smell of stored meat and the scent of human habitation in an otherwise empty landscape. Ada built an observation platform on top of the tent structure using driftwood and rope, creating a raised lookout point where she could watch for approaching bears and have some advance warning before they reached camp. When bears got too close to the perimeter, she fired warning shots from her elevated position. She never attempted to kill a polar bear. They were massive predators weighing up to 1,500 pounds, and killing one required shooting accuracy and ammunition she could not afford to waste. But she could scare them away temporarily, and temporary safety was all she needed to survive another day. She maintained a detailed diary throughout this period of complete isolation. The entries were short, factual, almost mechanical in their lack of emotional content. Saw a polar bear approaching from the north. It went away after I fired twice. I shot at seals today, but hit nothing. Weather is cold with wind. There was no space in her writing for fear or despair or philosophical reflection, just documented facts about what happened each day and what needed to happen next to continue surviving. She also kept herself occupied with construction projects that served both practical and psychological purposes. She built a traditional Inupiaq skin boat, an umiak using seal skins she had collected, and driftwood she had gathered from the beach. She had never been taught how to build one during her childhood before the mission school replaced that education. She was teaching herself from vague cultural memory and improvised engineering, creating something her ancestors would have recognized, even though no one had directly shown her the technique. The first boat she built was destroyed in a violent summer storm that tore through camp. She built another one immediately afterward, improving the design based on what had failed the first time. She sewed a pair of small moccasins for Bennett using scraps of seal skin and sinew thread. They were child-sized boots she planned to give him when she finally returned home, a tangible reminder of why she was fighting so hard to survive. She practiced her shooting accuracy, relentlessly by setting up rows of empty tea tins at increasing distances from camp and forcing herself to hit them consistently before she would allow herself to hunt live animals and waste precious ammunition on poor shots. The summer ice broke up in July as warmer temperatures returned and the ocean became navigable for ships. The relief vessel was supposed to arrive in summer, according to the original expedition plan. It was July now, then August, and Ada watched the horizon every single day for any sign of a ship. Nothing appeared. Each day without rescue meant another day of dwindling supplies and growing uncertainty about whether anyone was coming at all. By mid-August, Ada's food situation was becoming critical again. The hunting had been productive enough to keep her alive through the summer months, but only barely. She was noticeably thin, exhausted in ways that went beyond daily physical labor, running on reserves that were almost completely depleted. She wrote less frequently in her diary as August progressed. The entries that do exist from the final weeks are extremely short and terse. Checked traps, nothing. Saw seals, but too far away to shoot. Very tired. She was running out of physical and mental energy to document her own survival. On the morning of August 20th, 1923, Ada woke to an unusual sound cutting through the normal Arctic background noise. At first, she thought it might be a polar bear approaching camp from a different angle than usual. She grabbed the rifle instinctively and stepped out of the tent, prepared to fire a warning shot. Then she saw it through the coastal fog, a ship, an actual vessel, cutting through the water and heading directly toward Wrangel Island. She ran down the beach, stumbling over loose rocks and broken ice, waving her arms over her head and shouting at the top of her voice, even though she knew they probably could not hear her yet. The ship was the Donaldson, a schooner that had been hired by Harold Noyce, who had been contracted by Stephenson to check on the expedition's status and transport them home. The crew saw a small figure on the shore in tattered clothing, moving frantically to get their attention, and they brought the ship in as close to shore as the shallow, rocky coast allowed. Ada Blackjack had been on Wrangel Island for 23 months. She had survived 8 months in complete isolation without any human contact. She had taught herself to hunt seals, trap foxes, and navigate one of the most hostile environments on the planet. And when the crew of the Donaldson reached shore and found her alive, she was in reasonably good condition considering the circumstances. Harold Noyce wrote in his expedition log that night, "Blackjack has mastered her environment so far that it seems likely she could have survived another year if necessary." The world did not know what to do with Ada Blackjack when news of her survival reached newspapers across North America and Europe. She had survived when 4 men with expedition experience had not. That single fact alone made her story immediately newsworthy, but the narrative that quickly emerged in the press was not about her competence or capability. It was about luck and circumstance. Some newspaper articles called her fortunate to have been rescued. Others strongly implied that the 4 men had protected and provided for her before their deaths, conveniently ignoring the fact that the men were dead and she was not. The most persistent and widespread story claimed that Ada had simply waited passively to be rescued, doing nothing significant, a helpless woman who survived by avoiding action rather than through any skill or determination. None of that narrative was remotely true based on documented evidence. Harold Noyce, who had rescued her and spent time examining the camp and questioning her about the previous months, tried to construct a different public narrative. He wanted Ada to participate in a lecture tour across American cities, write a book about her experiences, capitalize on the public's intense interest in Arctic survival stories. He saw her as a marketable commodity, a compelling story that could be profitably exploited if packaged correctly. Had to refuse every proposal. She did not want fame or public attention. She did not want to relive Wrangel Island repeatedly in front of audiences who would never understand what those months had actually cost her mentally and physically. Lorne Knight's mother, devastated by her son's death, needed someone to blame for the loss. She publicly accused Ada of neglecting Knight, failing to care for him properly during his final illness, possibly even causing his death through incompetence or deliberate neglect. There was no evidence supporting any of these accusations. Ada's diary entries and the physical evidence at the camp clearly showed she had done everything humanly possible to keep Knight alive under impossible conditions. But Mrs. Knight needed a target for her grief, and Vilhjalmur Stephenson, the man who had organized the fundamentally flawed expedition and sent 5 people to a remote island with insufficient supplies, was not available or willing to accept blame publicly. The press picked up Mrs. Knight's accusations eagerly. Some articles painted Ada as negligent, weak, possibly cowardly, for being the one who survived when the men did not. It was significantly easier for society to blame a poor Inupiaq woman than to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth. 4 educated white men with resources and training had failed completely, while a small indigenous woman with neither resources nor training had succeeded through adaptation and relentless determination. Vilhjalmur Stephenson carefully distanced himself from the disaster in all his public statements. He never formally accepted responsibility for the deaths of Alan Crawford, Fred Maurer, Milton Galler, or Lorne Knight. He wrote about the Wrangel Island expedition as fundamentally successful in establishing a territorial claim for the British Empire. Even though all the men were dead and the territorial claim was eventually rejected by international consensus as having no legal validity, Stephenson moved on to other projects and continued lecturing about the friendly Arctic. He remained famous and respected in geographical societies. He continued promoting his theories while quietly ignoring the people who had died believing his reassurances. Ada received her contracted payment of $50 per month for the time she had spent on Wrangel Island, $600 total for nearly 2 years of unimaginable hardship. She used that money immediately to retrieve Bennett from the orphanage and bring him home to live with her. That was what mattered to Ada. Not the interviews people wanted, not the book deals publishers tried to push on her, not the public attention that followed her briefly. She wanted her son back, and she finally had enough money to make that happen. She lived quietly after Wrangel Island. She moved frequently around different parts of Alaska, working whatever jobs she could find, housekeeping for white families, sewing and mending clothes, any labor that paid enough to support herself and Bennett. She actively avoided talking about Wrangel Island whenever possible. The few interviews she reluctantly gave over the subsequent years were brief and lacking in detail. She rarely elaborated on her survival techniques or her emotional state during those months of isolation. It was a chapter of her life she had endured and survived, not one she wanted to continuously relive for the entertainment of strangers who had never faced anything remotely similar. People forgot about her with remarkable speed. The Wrangel Island expedition faded from public memory within a few years. By the 1930s, Ada Blackjack was just another poor woman in Alaska trying to raise her son and avoid drawing attention from authorities or employers. The newspapers that had briefly made her famous moved on to other stories. The geographical societies that had discussed her survival shifted their attention to new expeditions. She disappeared back into the invisibility that poor indigenous women occupied in early 20th century America. Bennett survived into adulthood despite his chronic health problems. Ada cared for him as long as she was physically able, though his tuberculosis left him with permanent respiratory weakness. Later in her life, Ada remarried and settled in the town of Palmer, Alaska. She attended a small Inupiaq church every Sunday. She lived simply and quietly, working when she was able, avoiding anything that might bring unwanted attention to her existence. She died on May 29, 1983, at the age of 85, at the Pioneer Home in Palmer. She is buried at Anchorage Memorial Park Cemetery. Her headstone carries a simple inscription, Heroine, Wrangel Island expedition, 1 month after her death. The Alaska state legislature passed a formal resolution honoring her survival as an extraordinary achievement that deserved public recognition and respect. It came 60 years too late to change anything about her life or provide any practical benefit, but at least someone in authority finally remembered what she had accomplished. The story of Ada Blackjack is not about luck or fortune or being in the right place at the right time. 4 young men traveled to Wrangel Island with formal training, substantial confidence, significant resources, and the enthusiastic backing of a famous Arctic explorer. They had read multiple books about Arctic survival strategies. They had studied Vilhjalmur Stefansson's detailed theories about living off northern land. They believed with complete certainty that they understood what they were walking into and how to handle whatever challenges arose. All 4 of them died. 3 lost on the ice during a desperate escape attempt, 1 from scurvy in a tent while being cared for by someone with no medical knowledge. Ada Blackjack traveled to the same island with none of those supposed advantages. She had been told her entire life by missionaries, employers, and broader society that she was weak, timid, fundamentally incapable of surviving outside the narrow domestic roles that society permitted Indigenous women to occupy. She had no wilderness training whatsoever. She had no hunting experience beyond vague childhood memories from before the mission school. She possessed a crippling fear of polar bears that bordered on genuine phobia. She could barely read English with any fluency, and she lived when everyone else died. The fundamental difference was not physical strength or intellectual capability, or even quality of preparation. The difference was adaptability in the face of failure. The 4 men believed they understood Arctic survival because they had studied it theoretically, read about it extensively, and discussed it with people they considered experts. When Wrangel Island refused to cooperate with their theoretical frameworks, when game populations did not match Stefansson's optimistic descriptions, when weather proved harsher than the book suggested, they did not fundamentally adjust their approach. They kept trying to force the Arctic to match their preconceptions instead of accepting the Arctic as it actually existed. That inflexibility killed them. Ada had no theoretical frameworks to cling to when reality contradicted them. She had no choice except to learn in real time or die quickly. Every single day on Wrangel Island presented problems she had never faced before, and every single day she solved those problems by attempting solutions, failing frequently, trying again with modifications, and refusing to stop trying. She did not survive because she was physically stronger than the men. She survived because she was willing to become someone fundamentally different than who she had been when she arrived on the island in September 1921. That transformation is what makes her story genuinely remarkable. Not the external survival itself, though that accomplishment is objectively impressive. The remarkable element is the internal shift from a woman absolutely convinced she was helpless and incompetent to a woman who could feed herself in Arctic winter conditions. From someone who could not fire a rifle without shaking uncontrollably to someone who could hunt seals and trap foxes and defend her camp against polar bears. From someone who desperately needed protection to someone who provided care and protection to a dying man and a small cat. The world in 1923 did not want to recognize that transformation or give it the credit it deserved. The world at that time did not want to believe that a small, poor, barely literate Inupiaq woman could demonstrate more capability and resilience than 4 educated white men with resources and backing. So newspapers called it luck, or they downplayed her active role, or they blamed her for Knight's death, or they simply forgot about her entirely once the initial newsworthiness faded. But the facts remain, preserved carefully in Ada's personal diary, in Harold Noyce's rescue logs, in the physical evidence left behind at the Wrangel Island camp, in the historical record that cannot be rewritten to fit more comfortable narratives. She built traditional Inupiaq skin boats from scratch without anyone teaching her the technique. She taught herself to hunt seals and trap foxes without any prior experience or guidance. She survived 8 complete months in total isolation in one of the harshest environments on Earth. She outlasted everything the Arctic threw at her, not by passively waiting for rescue, but by actively becoming the kind of person who did not need rescue to survive. That is not luck. That is not fortune. That is survival in its purest and most demanding form, adapting continuously, enduring unbearable conditions, refusing to accept that the story's ending has already been written by circumstances beyond your control. Ada Blackjack proved that survival sometimes belongs not to the strongest or the best prepared or the most confident, but to the most willing to change when change becomes the only path forward. Every week, we bring you a new story researched thoroughly, told carefully, and always true. If this account of Ada Blackjack's survival held your attention, there are dozens more stories waiting, each as compelling, each as impossible, and each as real as the small woman who taught herself to hunt on a frozen island in 1923. Subscribe to The Narrow Escape for more true stories of survival, escape, and the refusal to accept impossible odds. Because sometimes, against every logical expectation, people find a way through.